What's up, Wildside besties and baddies? I'm Bailey.
And I'm Chelsea, and we're here to walk you through the wild sides.
From homicides to hosticides and everything in between.
We're so glad you're here, so buckle up
and enjoy the ride. It's Wednesday.
Yeah, it's Wednesday. It is also interview week.
It is.
However, this week we will be interviewing a world-renowned or state-renowned or neighborhood-renowned LPC by the name of Bailey.
It's a me.
It's a me. I'm getting interviewed. So yeah, no, we have a lot of people who are like, man, I just wish I could hear more about what Bailey has to say as far as trauma or, love avoidance or just the things that Bailey gets to touch on, but never really gets to elaborate because, again, there's a lot of ethical spider webs around what we do, and we want to always be professional and things like that. So we thought, and we've had requests that we should interview Bailey and just get her take on what she does, her specialty, which again is trauma. It's also sex addiction. It's addiction in general. I mean, it really touches on a lot of what we cover in our cases. So that's what we're going to do. You're going to get a little bit more of an in-depth look into Bailey's cute little brain.
So let's just call it like it is. To be totally fair, part of the reason this is happening is because the sisters over here, the Wildside sisters, we have not had the best week. I have had some major gastrointestinal stuff that doctors can't figure out. Chelsea, unfortunately, her 14-year-old boxer Diesel passed away. And she's had a hard time with that. And so we've just been kind of under the weather the last week. And we have some interviews lined up, but we're kind of just in a weird rut spot. So this is probably the best place to plug this interview because I think I would just avoid it until death. But the circumstances has forced me to do this.
Or we could just be like, no, this is exactly how we planned it. So
yeah, and so it works out because the case that we're going to be covering is a negligent homicide case, and it has to do with therapy. And so I'm going to have a lot to say throughout the episode, but we are going to follow up with just an in-depth interview, and we have a listener, a fan, who's going to come on with Chelsea, and they're going to be the interviewer, and I'm going to be the interviewee. So We'll see how quickly Apple Podcasts makes us remove that episode for explicit language.
Just for poor quality all around. No, it's going to be great. I will say I got to meet some friends / family members / listeners to our podcast. And they actually, were going on, and they were just like, man, we're really digging you guys' podcast. Like, this has been really great. And they were like, are you going to do a shout out to us on your podcast? And I was like, I mean, yeah, we can make that happen. And they were going to be like, are you going to tell them like, yeah, we were hanging out with some family and we witnessed a murder? And I was like, what? We did? And it was like, yeah, us murdering these crabs that we caught. Like, oh, that was so good. We had us a crab boil. So, no, it's been good. It's been good. Life's good. Life's been good to me so far. My black Impala goes 85.
I lost my license too high when I drive. So who's the original singer of that song?
So that would be Joe Walsh from the Eagles? Question
Yeah,
mark.
so Joe Walsh is the original singer, but Fun fact, one of mine and my husband's favorite bands of all time is the Dirty Heads. If you guys haven't listened to the Dirty Heads, you got to check them out because we're big, big fans. And they did a redo of that song, and it's classic and it's perfect, just like they are.
Yeah, I'm also a fan. I got turned on to them as well. They're easy to love.
Yeah, well, if you were talking to Zach, he'd be like,
I was a fan back when they were playing in bars and I saw them for like
Whatever.
$2. And I'm like, okay, Lavana,
Whatever.
going to a movie theater for a nickel. Shut up.
you know what I mean? Like,
If you ask Zach, he was like the original Dirty Heads fan, and I'll allow it. But that is definitely it's our jam.
Like I said, they're easy to love, but I have a feeling that the person in our case is probably not as easy
Yeah.
to love.
And so a couple of disclaimers for this one, you guys. This is, like I said, a negligent homicide case, and it has to do with the therapy world. And so for the listeners who don't know, I am a therapist. I was in school for like a bajillion years, earned my stripes in the field working addiction and trauma, worked really hard for many, many years. And I say all of that to say that this case is pretty personal. It represents everything I'm really passionate about, and that's primarily doing right by clients, having strong ethics, providing therapy to individuals to help them, to not hurt them. And so you might hear me go on kind of little rants here and there, but I think at the end, you guys will all really understand where I'm coming from. And unfortunately, it happened. We shouldn't be here today to talk about it, but unfortunately, we are. And this is really what happens when therapy goes wrong. And this is the totally unnecessary, totally gut-wrenching case in the death of Candace Newmaker.
Candace Newmaker.
And so to get to what crux of this story, I think we have to start off by giving you a background of Candace's childhood, but more importantly, her mother, because I think this is a case of a lot of just really unfortunate circumstances that all piled together to create this kind of perfect storm. And so we're going to talk a lot about Candace, her biological mother, and her name is Angela Maria Elmore, but she goes by Angie. So we're going to talk a lot about Angie. We're going to dive into her background, her upbringing, because it really plays into the dynamics of the beginning of Candace.
Okay.
Angie Elmore grew up in a pretty unstable environment. Angie's mother, so now we're talking about grandma here. Angie's mother, Mary Clendenin, was a product of foster care herself, and likely that really impacted how Candace's mom, Angie, molded into an adult and molded into a mother herself. So now we're kind of talking a little bit about 3 generations. So Grandma Mary eventually had Mama Angela, followed by Angie's little brother, Albert.
Okay.
And growing up, Angie's mother, Mary, moved from place to place. So probably not too uncommon, especially since Mary grew up in the foster world.
Yeah.
And so moving around was pretty typical, unfortunately. And so Mary and the kids, Angie and Albert, they were constantly on the move, never stayed in one place long enough to plant any meaningful roots.
Yeah.
Sometimes Mary could take care of Angie and Albert, but sometimes when Mary was unable to, the kids were often left in the custody of Lincoln County Department of Social Services in North Carolina. And so the kids were kind of popped in and out of foster care, depending on Mary's ability to care for them.
Do we know what years this is roughly?
So this is probably the late 70s, early 80s, just for my quick math, but I think that's somewhat around that time.
Okay. I'm always curious. I would love, that kind of sparks a thought. I would love to do some research as to what that looked like back in the 70s.
Angie was 18 in 1989. So what is 1989 minus 18?
71?
Yeah. So we're talking early 70s here.
Yeah, I would love to know kind of what the foster system looked like back in the 70s. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it would just be really interesting. Because I think when we say things like being raised in the foster system, I think that's different for every person, especially generationally because
Yeah.
of the evolution of laws and just, acts and things like that. So it would be very interesting to see what that looked like in the 70s.
Yeah, I didn't go down that rabbit hole too much. I just kind of kept that surface level because I think, like any case, it could have turned into like a three-parter if we
Yeah.
really dug into all of that.
Yeah.
So, needless to say, with Mary, with the kids kind of going to Lincoln County Social Services on and off, depending on Mary's ability to care for them, it didn't exactly create a healthy, consistent, nurturing life for Angie and her brother.
Sure.
Being passed back and forth between mom and foster care, I can't imagine how hard that would be for children. So, without much adult consistency and guidance for herself, Angie had to grow up young and she had to learn things on her own.
Yeah.
She had a reputation in the foster care system in her area for being temperamental, having fits of rage, and struggling with mental health issues. I mean, right.
I know. And that's reputations are so, like, yes, they're warranted, but they're so unfair because it's like, I probably would be angry too if I was passed around like a hot potato.
Yeah. And y'all will hear this a lot, but this is pretty classic, like attachment trauma. So whenever you don't attach to your primary caregivers really well, these are a lot of the times the results from that. So by the time she was 16 years old, Angie had gotten pregnant and she gave birth to a baby boy. Now, at this time, Angie's still in foster care at this time when she gets pregnant. So being 16 years old, living in the foster system as a foster child herself, she decided the best thing she could do for her son is to give him up for adoption.
Yeah. Yep.
She was adult enough, even at 16, to know that her son would not have a good life with her, like she had bouncing around in the foster system. So she made the ultimate sacrifice and gave him away to a family who could take care of him. Now, this is, as we've talked about, Mary was in foster care, now Angie, right? And she had this son. And so this is like third generation foster system trauma, right?
Right.
And so that's why I think it's really important to bring all this up because it's going to really tie into the story with Candace. So when Angie was 17 years old, she ended up meeting a man named Todd Elmore in a little Baptist church in a tiny town in North Carolina called Maiden. Todd was 6 years older than Angie, so he was 23, and he came with a long history of criminal behaviors that continued into their marriage. Mostly the criminal behaviors were kind of petty things like driving without a license and running from cops and that kind of thing. But Angie didn't exactly marry Todd for his charm or his heart because by all accounts, Todd was a very abusive and violent man. And so I think it's safe to say that Angie married Todd because he was older, he was a little bit more stable, and he was a way out.
So is that the proper definition of trauma bonding, being attracted to the same trauma that you've been exposed to?
Yes. When you repeat the same attachment style, like the trauma with your attachment style with a primary caregiver, and you repeat that in a relationship later on.
So when you have these situations where people are like, what on earth were they thinking? They grew up with somebody like this. Why would they then choose someone like this? Is that essentially, that's trauma bonding?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a good way to look at it. And so she married him as a way out, a way to get out of the foster system, a way to get away from her mother's dysfunction. And so Angie and Todd ended up remaining in, now this is really hard for me to say, Lincolnton, North Carolina. And about a year into their marriage, on November 19th, 1989, when Angela was 18, she gave birth to a baby girl that they named Candace Tiara.
Okay. Yeah.
According to a super thorough article in the Denver Rocky Mountain News by Carla Crowder and Peggy Lowe, and shout out to them because I'm going to be referencing this article a whole lot. According to this article, Angie wanted Candace, and it was planned. It was a planned pregnancy. So she felt stable. She wanted a baby. Angie would do all of the things that a mother wanted to do, who was really into, being the best mom for this child. She would play classical music. She would read stories aloud when she was pregnant with Candace. And she made all the promises to her that she would take care of her and give her a life that she deserved.
Yeah.
After Candace was born, Angie and Todd ended up having 2 more children. Chelsea came in 1991 and Michael came in 1992.
Strong
names. So by the end of 1992, the Elmores had 3 children under the age of 3. Candace was 3, Chelsea was 1, and Michael was a newborn.
No, that's a lot.
That's a lot.
That's the like sixth most stressful job.
Ah, dude, the top 1, 2, and 3 most stressful jobs altogether. So in order to try and support the kids, the children, Angie would get odd jobs here and there to try to bring in steady income. And I think it's safe to say that steady jobs in rural North Carolina is probably pretty hard to come by. Angie worked at a nursing home. She worked at a fast food restaurant, tried to attend beauty school, but was unable to finish. I mean,
Yeah.
it's really hard when you don't have family support or the funds for consistent daycare, right?
Right.
So no surprise that Todd, Angie's husband, wasn't much help in this arena as well. He was often unemployed and really wasn't able to contribute financially to the 3 little ones.
Yeah.
The Elmores, unfortunately, just like Angie's childhood, they ended up moving frequently. They lived in impoverished environments, from rundown trailers to apartments and housing projects.
No.
They relied heavily on pawning whatever belongings they could. It was reported that in the first few years with the kids, Todd pawned close to 100 items, which included Angie's wedding ring and the baby's high chair. So they were literally just barely surviving.
Yeah. Yep. What is that? I heard it said the other day, the only people who think that money is the root of all evil are people who haven't actually been that poor. You know, pretty much saying like, yeah, you think money's that bad? You've obviously never been just like scraping the bottom of the barrel poor.
Right. Yeah. And like I said, they were barely surviving. And after years and years of abuse from Todd, Angie made the decision to pick up her babies, and she headed to a domestic violence shelter. You know, and thank goodness for people who do that work.
No joke.
It was there in a shelter where Candace, the oldest of the 3 babies, she ended up spending her 3rd birthday there. Doesn't that just rip your soul out?
Going to say, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get through this episode because I'm already just like I'm struggling a little bit because this just pulls.
It gets really, really bad.
Yeah, this just pulls at my heartstrings. I don't do well with this stuff. It's so funny, the stuff that we don't do well with, you know, it's different for every person, but
that's why I don't work with children. I don't think I could work. I think it takes a special angelic presence to work with children. I can have my tough shell on, and I think that's why I can do true crime, is because I'm so used to wearing plexiglass around me as a therapist. Like, people are like, oh, this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. And I'm just like, yeah, it sucks. Now we got to figure out how to fix it. But when like little babies come in and they're bruised or they've been abused, I have a real hard time with that one. So shout out to everybody who works with kids. So Candace spent her 3rd birthday in a domestic violence shelter. And by all accounts, Candace was super strong-willed, and she had a really strong personality. She was protective, tenderhearted, but she was also rebellious. And I think that plays into the events that's later going to unfold as we get into them.
Sure.
But because of the circumstances that we've talked about, the inconsistencies, despite everyone's efforts, unfortunately, all 3 kids were eventually taken into CPS custody, on and off. So they were constantly on and off being removed from Angie's custody. By the time that Candace was 5 years old, it was the final straw for CPS, and that stands for Child Protective Services. Sometimes it's the Department of Children and Family Services, DFAC, CPS. They're all kind of the same thing with different letters. They removed all 3 children from the home and placed them into foster care. And that same year, Angie's parental rights were terminated when Candace was 5.
I have a quick thought. Have you ever played like a free game on your phone, like where you have to use coins? You earn free like fake money?
No.
Okay. I'm into that stuff. I love just like doing mind-numbing, solitaire, that you earn these fake, coins and stuff like that. And it dawned on me the other day, like I had a really good run of some good luck and I built up a lot of coins, right? And I was making this fake money left and right because I had built up a lot of coins. And it really did kind of solidify in a really weird way this idea of you have to have money to make money. Most people, if they are coming from absolutely nothing, they don't have stable jobs, they don't, you know what I mean? It really is hard to get out of that rut and get ahead. Does that make sense? So my heart really does. As much as I'm like, you got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, every once in a while I get these glimpses of like, well, I can't make a huge investment in this game because I don't have the money to like play big, bet big, win big with my fake solitaire money. And I think it's the same in real life. Like when you don't have any money and you don't have a way to invest and to move yourself to that next level, it's really hard to
Sure.
do that, especially when you have 3 kids. So before everybody starts jumping on the like, well, she just needs to take care of her kids and blah, blah, blah. I just think we all need to kind of think about the fact that sometimes you have to have money to make money.
Oh, 100%. And, again, and y'all hear me go on the soapbox a whole lot about this concept of the construct of safety in humans. And I think humans are natural finger pointers because it gives them the illusion of safety.
Mm-hmm.
Because we can point at Angie and say, well, you picked an abusive husband. That's your fault. If you hadn't done that, you wouldn't be in this situation.
Sure.
Right. And like, while that's valid, right, just in a black and white on paper perspective, that's not all encompassing.
Right.
She had no idea what healthy relationships looked like. So
Right.
if, you know, someone comes and tells me that the sky is green and I have to bet money whenever I get it on the color of the sky and I'm always wrong and I don't understand why people are always getting money and they just naturally know that the sky is blue, right? It really changes your perspective of everything.
Sure.
And so that's why I started off with this is like, this is generational. I mean, multi-generational compounding into this situation.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. She has not known anybody alive that has had a healthy relationship. She didn't have grandparents to look to. She didn't, you know what I mean? Like some of us at least have like, oh, well, we had really great grandparents or we had a really great great grandmother. Like we had somebody in our life. And when you have none of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so naturally, when Candace was taken permanently from Angie's custody when she was 5, Candace just did not adjust well. Obviously, she acted out. She had crying, like completely unmanageable crying fits and huge temper tantrums. I mean, as you can imagine.
Sure.
But fortunately / unfortunately, 2 years later, on June 14th in 1996, Candace was formally adopted. And she was adopted by a woman named Jeane Elizabeth Newmaker. Candace Tiara Elmore became Candace Elizabeth Newmaker.
Oh, they changed her middle name as well?
Yes, according to North Carolina's record books.
Wow. Yikes.
Now, I don't know if this woman's name is Jeane or Jeannie because it's Jeane. So that could be Jeannie or it could be Jeane.
Or it could be Gina. You know what? I've seen some wild spelling. So I say go with Jeannie or
I'm going to go with Jeannie because there's an E at the end.
go with Jeannie.
Yeah. So Jeannie was actually a single woman, but she was working as a pediatric nurse practitioner in Durham, North Carolina. So she had a really stable job. She had a good income. And that's why she, as a single person, was able to adopt Candace on her own.
Mhm.
And in order to really take her time and bond with her new adoptive daughter, Jeannie took 2 months off of work when Candace moved in. And it was really apparent that Jeannie really adored Candace and tried to give her everything she could. Candace had new clothes, new toys, and started to live in a pretty consistent manner once she was adopted by Jeannie.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Candace began attending Eastleigh Elementary School, where Candace did her best to adapt. Candace was described by different teachers as quirky, a bright little girl, and easy to love. Candace took care of other children who had developmental disabilities or physical handicaps and didn't appear to have any of the same behavioral problems that CPS had seen while she was in foster care, which is no surprise, right? You take somebody out of survival mode, they're going to be a completely different person when they're thriving versus surviving, right?
Yeah.
And so by all accounts, over the next couple of years, Jeannie did everything she could for Candace. She enrolled her in horse riding lessons because Candace loved horses. She took swimming. She took ballet. She started making friends.
Yeah.
Candace was a pretty typical little girl who had a little bit of a mischievous side, but still struggled with her temper.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And we have to remember that even though this is a stable background, she still misses her mom. Right.
Yep. She still is having to get over and cope with the fact that she misses her mom.
Yeah.
Right?
And by all reports, her mom she loved the shit out of those kids, right?
Right. Yeah.
She couldn't take care of them financially. And so CPS deemed that, but she wasn't abusive to the children.
Right.
She just couldn't provide for them. And so inside this kind of happy new household, Jeannie was having a really hard time. Jeannie was in her early 40s when she adopted Candace, and even though she knew about her background, she still had a hard time. I mean, because it is a transition for even the adoptive parents, right? Taking in a child.
Yep.
And according to that same article by Carla Crowder and Peggy Lowe, one of the pastors at church, Reverend David McBriar, he said Jeannie adopted Candace when others might not have. She thought she could help her. She thought she could provide a stable home for her. And he also shared that Candace was a handful. And so not only that, but Jeannie felt like she wasn't bonding or connecting with Candace at all.
Yeah.
By the time Candace was 7, Jeannie really started to struggle with Candace's lack of affection and what Jeannie perceived to be bonding with her. So she adopts this kid, she gives her everything, but she's not getting that warm, affectionate little girl that she was hoping for, right?
Yeah.
Jeannie also reported that Candace was very emotionally volatile. According to an article by CBS News, Jeane Newman had shared that Candace was a child who raged uncontrollably, once attempting to set the house on fire. And so, as any logical step would be for someone in Jeannie's position, she turned to professional help.
Yeah.
Jeannie took Candace to a whole array of specialists, therapists, psychiatrists, medical professionals at Duke University, everyone to try to figure out the reason behind Candace's supposed bad behaviors. Candace was placed on a number of different medications to help with, these supposed behavioral issues. Candace would go on to spend years on medication, seeing psychologists, but Jeannie says the sessions often ended with her daughter biting and spitting at the therapists. All of these accounts by Jeannie really pointed to the potential diagnosis that ranged from mood disorders to ADHD to attachment disorder. So all these professionals are saying that they could all be these different things.
Sure.
But more specifically, some of the thought around Candace's diagnosis was RAD, reactive attachment disorder.
Yeah. Oh man, what case? We just talked about that a couple of days
Yeah,
ago.
I don't remember what case it was, but
Yeah.
I am going to include a little bit about RAD from like a clinical perspective because it's totally essential to this episode.
Sure.
And so according to the DSM, the classification for RAD is it's an attachment disorder, and it's a trauma and stressor related condition of early childhood caused by social neglect and maltreatment.
Okay.
And so arguably, even though mom wasn't socially neglectful or necessarily didn't treat her well, arguably there was social neglect and maltreatment just from the level of poverty that she lived in.
I was going to say almost like by proxy type of thing, like as
Yeah.
a result, or I should say as a result of just her
Yeah.
environment, her upbringing.
And so children who are affected by RAD have a really, really hard time forming emotional attachments to others. So they can come off as cold, they can come off as kind of stoic or completely just angry and aggressive, right? Where they don't form that attachment. They show a decreased ability to experience positive emotions, and they have a really hard time seeking or accepting physical or emotional closeness.
Okay.
So which means sometimes they can get violent when they're held, cuddled, or comforted.
Okay.
So like literally everything that is intuitive to being a mother, if you adopt a child with RAD, if you don't have, and this is not a slight against Jeannie by any means, but if you don't have a really good understanding, you get your feelings hurt.
Thinking about the amount of kids that I've seen. Now, I have not been in the school systems for 20 years. I've been in them for, 4 going on 5. But the amount of kids that I've seen, I don't know if I can think of one kid off of the top of my head that shows signs or symptoms of that. And my point to that is I can't imagine that RAD diagnoses are all that common.
Yeah, I mean, so I can't really speak to that because again, I don't work with children, and this is more of like you see it in younger children to younger adolescents. So I don't honestly really have an answer to that, but like I've known a couple of adults who had been diagnosed in their younger years, and we had a lot of trauma work to do as an adult, right?
Sure.
And so kids with RAD, usually from a behavioral perspective, they're unpredictable. It's really hard to comfort and console them, and they're difficult to discipline.
Mm-hmm.
And their moods fluctuate erratically. They can kind of be all over the place, all over the map. And they seem to live kind of in constant flight, fight, or freeze mode.
Yeah.
So it is definitely not a walk in the park. It does take 9 times out of 10, it takes professional help when working with these kids who are so traumatized
Sure.
and have such a fractured attachment style. So RAD shares similarities to other diagnoses like PTSD or borderline personality disorder. And the only way to really be quote unquote diagnosed with RAD is it's a very thorough and lengthy assessment process by a licensed professional. So you can't take them to somebody and they're just like, oh yeah, this person's got this. Like there's an actual assessment process that you have to go through.
You can't download that app and answer a couple
No.
of questions.
So this lead in the sand, Jeannie decided to attend an attachment disorder workshop in North Carolina. And that is where she heard symptoms that sounded identical to Candace's. And it led her to finding a group called ATTACH, and that stands for the Association for the Treatment and Training in the Attachment of Children. And so she found this group, and then that's what led her to attend the ATTACH National Conference in 1999. Okay. So Jeannie's really trying everything she can to try to help Candace. And it was at this national conference in 99 where Jeannie ended up meeting a therapist by the name of Bill Goebel. And so she struck up kind of an offhand conversation with him. She's given him all of these symptoms of Candace, right? And so Bill hands her a checklist, like just a general checklist, and says, I want you to check off Candace's behaviors according to, what you've seen. Jeannie fills it out. She, checks off the symptoms, hands it back to him, and he scores her as severe. Now, this is a clinician who's never spent any time with Candace, who's never even looked at her medical records, and who's literally only taking the mother's perspective of this child's behavior, and he's giving her a pseudo-diagnosis of severe attachment issues.
Yeah.
I'm not saying he's wrong, but ethically, that's a no. You don't do that.
Nope.
Like people come to me all the time and they're like, oh, my husband does this, this, and this. Is he a sex addict? I'm like, I am not going to answer that question.
Yeah.
I'll give you resources. You can take that person to a professional and have person fully assessed, but there's no quicker way for me to get sued or get my license pulled than for me to be like, oh yeah, this person's got this and it's pretty severe.
And just on another side note, if you have received off the cuff diagnoses, I would be very leery of that. You know what I mean? Like if someone is coming up to you and it's like, oh, I saw your kid and they were throwing a tantrum and I think they might have some blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, don't.
I can't tell you how many clients I've worked with who come to me and, I'm doing their biopsychosocial and they're like, oh, I've been diagnosed with, schizophrenia or borderline and all this stuff. And I'm always just like I remember one time I was meeting this guy, and it was for inpatient residential substance abuse. And he said he had a history of a schizophrenia. And I said, it's interesting. I said, he was, I don't know, he was in his mid to late 30s. I said, how long have you had this? And he was like, well, I just got diagnosed with it like 6 months ago. And I was like, okay, but you're telling me that your primary substance use is methamphetamine. Yes. How long have you been abusing methamphetamine? 7 years. Okay, well, ethically, you shouldn't be diagnosing somebody with a mental health disorder if they're in active addiction. And so he was like, well, I was, feeling bugs crawling on me and I was, hallucinating. I was like, right, which are all symptoms of methamphetamine addiction.
Right.
Like, I'm not saying that doctor was wrong. I'm simply saying, unless that man had been clean and sober, proven for 6 months at the very least, you don't need to be slapping a diagnosis on him with schizophrenia.
And if you have included that information to your primary care doctor, you know what I mean? Like you walk in and say, I'm feeling bugs crawling on me. And they don't ask, do you have a history of methamphetamine abuse? You know what I mean? Like you're not getting the full picture, guys. Yeah. You need a full picture.
So we told y'all that this whole episode was going to be full of little side rants, and at least we own up to what we say. So he gives her this quiz. She takes a self-report. He says, yep, it's severe. And he was like, there needs to be a lot more interaction with the child in question by a professional who's licensed to assess and diagnose. So Bill gives Jeane the recommendation for an attachment specialist in Colorado that he thinks could help Jeane and Candace.
And they're still living in North Carolina.
They're in North Carolina, and this is a specialist in Colorado.
Okay.
And so again, according to Carla Crowder and Peggy Lowe's article, this Bill Goebel character gave Jeane the recommendation for this specialist by the name of Connell Watkins.
Okay.
Watkins was an unlicensed psychotherapist living in Evergreen, Colorado. Okay. Now, another side rant, but still very important to this case. A little explanation around the term unlicensed so we can really understand this. When someone chooses to be a counselor or a therapist, like myself, you have to complete an undergraduate degree, and then you have to complete a graduate degree.
Mm-hmm.
So usually a master's degree in something relative to counseling or psychology.
Right.
Nowadays, in order to practice as a counselor or a therapist in your state, you have to have gone through a K-CREPT accredited university. So not all programs are K-CREPT accredited, so that it has to be K-CREPT accredited for you to practice. Okay. And so that always includes a hands-on component to the program. So it's like an internship followed by a practicum, right? So you have to practice before you just go off and blow in the wind by yourself as a therapist, right? And so this is where usually in this internship or practicum, you can start working with clients, but you have to be working under a licensed supervisor so they can sign off on every hour and supervise your time in the field.
Right.
Okay. So like literally every hour that you spend, like my good friend that I did private practice with, Sandra, she was my supervisor. And so every week we would meet and go over literally every hour, every client, what we did, what interventions, and all of that stuff. Okay. Whatever state you're getting licensed in, your supervisor has to be licensed in that state as well. So you can't get a supervisor from Connecticut and if you're in Florida, unless they're dual licensed in Florida as well. Right. Makes sense. Yeah. It's just like dental hygiene or pharmacy or whatever. It's like any licensure.
Sure.
So you have to collect so many hours, and it differs from state to state. But many of clinical supervision is for your field experience. Once you pass that successfully, you can graduate with your master's degree, but this still isn't enough to practice independently. So just because you did all of that supervision, you got all of your hours signed off, so you can practice, you're an associate counselor in most kind of terms of the word, but you still need a fully independently licensed person to sign off on your stuff until you're fully independently licensed.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Okay.
So this person could have been in a master's program, educated, but
Sure.
they had not gone through the however many 2,000, 3,000, whatever hours under clinical supervision to be
Correct.
To have received an independent license.
Yeah, she was unlicensed, which means she didn't even have an associate license.
Oh.
So she was unlicensed. She didn't have a license to her name. And so, like you were saying, once you'd go through all of that, it usually, depending on the state, when you're an associate, like you have your like preliminary license before you're independent, it can be 2 to 4 years before you get your independent license.
Right.
That's why when I passed my exam for my license, I went to Hooters and had a Corona with lime and some wings.
Mm-hmm. And cried.
And I was just like, wow,
Finally.
Yeah. So it's a whole lot. So what we're looking at, 4 years of grad school, you get your provisional license, you practice for 2 or 3 or 4 years, and you apply again for your independent unrestricted license. Once you have that, then you can open up your own private practice, and you no longer need a clinical supervisor to sign off on your hours. Okay.
Right.
So you can open up a practice and work with somebody who's licensed if you're not fully independently licensed. But a lot of people don't do that because it's risky, because you have to have malpractice insurance. You still
Sure.
have to pay for your license. You have to pay for continuing education. So there's a lot that goes into it. Okay. So I say all of this. I know that was a whole lot of information, but I think it's really important to know is that this woman who is this quote unquote specialist that Bill had referred Jeane to, Connell Watkins, she was not licensed. She did not have her license to practice therapy without a supervisor.
That family would have probably been better off coming to see me in my house and having me
Probably.
counsel them. No offense.
Watkins, operating without a license, working under her mentor, Dr. Foster Cline, who was at one time was considered Colorado's pioneer in attachment disorder. Okay, so she was working under this supposed super pioneer dude. According to the website Advocates for Children in Therapy, in the 1970s, Cline, this dude, Dr. Foster Cline, founded an attachment therapy center in Colorado called the Youth Behavior Program. This later became the Attachment Center at Evergreen, or ACE, and it was the most prominent center for attachment therapy for many, many years. Now, kind of as a foreboding here, he eventually was told to surrender his license to practice medicine in Colorado because of usually you only have to do that when you're unethical and you have unethical practices that the board reviews. And he retired in Idaho, but continued his treatment approaches in a different state.
Sure.
Because that's what people do.
I was going to say, because that's kind of how people roll.
So this is the situation. Jeane is a very educated woman. She's a pediatric nurse. She's adopted a child that has significant trauma, supposedly a quote unquote attachment disorder. She meets this random guy at a conference, says that there's this wonderful clinic in Colorado that are pioneers in this field, and they would be a great fit for Jeane and Candace, even though they didn't have a license to operate independently. Now, just to be clear, there's a lot of hate for the mother, Jeane, in this whole process, but I want to be super clear that if a doctor tells you something and makes a recommendation, typically as a layperson, you go and follow that recommendation, right? Should you do your own research? I mean, yeah, but if you're operating under a dude who is a pioneer in the field and is signing off on this woman's program, then that's all the research you need to do.
Well,
Fair?
not only that, but Bailey, like you've said, you specialize in trauma, you specialize in addiction, you work primarily with adults. So for somebody to come to you and say, oh, you're a therapist, what should I do about my marriage? You're kind of like, I am a therapist,
but not that
however, I'm not that kind of therapist. So just because this woman was
somebody has to take his money and run. No, I'm just kidding.
But just because this woman was a nurse practitioner, like she was an educated woman, she's not a psychologist.
She's not a clinician. And that's just like, I'm a well-educated, very successful clinician. But if my daughter had a medical issue and some medical dude was like, you need to go to this medical thing, I'm not going to question that a whole lot.
Yeah, you didn't go through med school. That's not what your background is in. You know what I mean? Like, I hope people are understanding. Like, you can't just lump people into like, oh, well, she was smart and educated. She's a doctor, a nurse practitioner.
Yeah. So this Connell Watkins, she was known, her kind of niche. She was known for a specialized form of reattachment therapy known as rebirthing. So this rebirthing, rebirthing theory is a process that mimics the birthing process, and it's designed for children that struggle with attachment issues, and it's meant to recreate the experience of being birthed or emerging from the womb.
Crap. I've heard about this like in passing. Like, I don't know a whole bunch about this, but there
have actually been multiple cases about this.
My spidey senses are tingling.
Yeah. And so according to an article by Deborah Josephson, rebirthing therapy is itself a fringe treatment. It was developed in the 70s by a dude named Leonard Orr. He was a psychotherapist, and its predominantly breathing technique rarely lasts more than 15 minutes. Okay, that's how it was founded to look. However, the therapy that would be used on Candace was a variant that was designed to simulate the birth process and is a type of regression therapy. According to an article by Kyle Haney, attachment therapy practices like rebirthing interventions, quote, operate with limited research and use techniques that are rooted in a less evidence-based rage theory, which makes it difficult to support the limited positive effects found. Highly vulnerable caregivers of maltreated, adopted, or fostered children are susceptible to believing the claims of improvement on fringe websites and support networks. So essentially, it's a gimmick even though the people doing it don't believe it's a gimmick, but it's not an evidence-based practice.
Right.
So it's experiential, which means it's experimental, right?
Right.
It really makes these people who have really wounded children believe that this is the fix, right? This is how I'm going to fix my baby.
Oh my gosh. This makes me very uneasy.
Yeah. So even though the individuals are essentially insinuating that they're pioneers in this field, there's not really a whole lot of data or research to back up the effectiveness clinically, whether it be the clinical orientation or the approach. According to a book, Attachment Therapy on Trial, attachment therapy, which is AT, it includes several techniques that use physical restraint, painful physical stimulation. AT practitioners claim that emotional disturbances are an inevitable result of such experiences, and it's usually this type of therapy, fringe therapy, because it's offered outside of the usual boundaries of psychology and medicine. So it's a pseudoscience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
With the recommendations made by homeboy Bill Goebel and hope to better bond with her daughter, on January 20th, 2000, Jeane signed a contract with Connell Watkins, agreeing to pay $7,000 for a 2-week rebirthing therapy. Now, remember, it was initially created for a 15-minute process. So she's paying for a 2-week intensive therapy. So Jeane booked a plane ticket from North Carolina to Colorado, heading to Watkins's practice in Evergreen, Colorado. Part of the appeal for this practice and this option is that it came with a private home stay where Jeane could stay with one of Watkins's assistants, so she didn't have to stay in a hotel apart from Candace. And on April 10th of that year of 2000, this 2-week intensive begins for Candace. During the course of the intensive, Candace met with Dr. John Alston. He was a psychiatrist who worked at the Attachment Center at Evergreen, and he was over Candace's medication management. Candace's medications and dosages were changed numerous times over the 2-week span because Candace wasn't having any breakthroughs that everyone had hoped for. The individuals involved in this rebirthing intensive included 54-year-old Connell Watkins and 40-year-old Julie Ponder, who was the only licensed therapist in the room that day. She had been issued her marriage and family therapist license, so she was an MFT in California just 10 months before. So she had her license for 10 months before she came in to do this, super exclusive fringe therapy.
I wish there was a noise that my body would make when I shake my head, just so you guys could understand how many times I have shaken my head while Bailey is talking. I'm just like, no, abort, turn around. Do not seek the treasure.
Yes. Julie Ponder was the only licensed therapist in this whole process. Candace and her mother, Jeane, were hosted by a couple in their home, acting almost as a foster family for them. 41-year-old Britta St. Clair was Watkins' office manager who doled out Candace's medication to her, even though she wasn't, she didn't have any sort of training or anything for doling out medication. And Britta's fiance, 47-year-old Jack McDaniel, who Candace, by the way, was told to call Daddy Jack. He was a high school graduate with no clinical training and was paid to write a report about the intensive. So this is this all-exclusive place, and this is what's happening.
This is like the super center for unethical.
Oh, yeah.
Like if unethical had a super center with just, a garden variety of all the things unethical in one spot, this would be it.
Yeah.
This play is called Unethical.
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 Yeah. So the first week of the intensive program, Connell Watkins and Julie Ponder led Jeane and Candace through compression therapy. This is where Candace was wrapped in a sheet, leaving her head exposed while lying on the ground. She was sandwiched between the two cushions while Jeane laid across Candace. Apparently, this exercise, if you will, is to highlight the concept of control so Candace can learn that Jeane is the mother and is in charge. Chelsea's not having this. She's not doing it.
I can't do this. I had a friend in Colorado, when we lived in Colorado, I had a friend who went to this woman who put a piece of broccoli in a jar and then held it up to her arm and was like, do you feel how your arm is wanting to drop? That means that you're allergic to cruciferous vegetables. And I'm just like, where do these people, what is
Listen,
happening?
there's a whole lot. Yeah, there's a whole lot. And so if this went well, then Candace would make some connection to Jeane, whether it's eye contact, physical touch, etc. This compression therapy, if you will, lasted for 3 hours.
Stop it.
Afterward, Jeane moved to a chair, and Candace was instructed to crawl to her mother, be picked up, wrapped in her mother's arms while Jeane fed Candace like a baby. Apparently, Candace did as she was told. I mean, yep. She was a little girl. And so this was considered a breakthrough. Everybody was like, great, she's being fed like a baby and she's listening to you. This is a breakthrough. Unfortunately, it was not satisfactory for the adults involved. Candace still needed to work on her attachment with Jeane, so by week 2, the next goal was the rebirthing session. Again, really not supposed to last more than 15 minutes, but the rebirthing session that Candace was a part of crept close to an hour, and this is where it gets horrifically terrible and sad. The rebirthing session again was to allow Candace to re-experience the birthing process so she could bond with her adoptive mother. Essentially, she was to be reborn to Jeane, forget about her old attachments to her biological mother, with whom Candace lived for her first 5 years of life. The entire process was videotaped. I haven't watched it, and I will not if I have an option, and was eventually used in the court proceedings years later. Candace was wrapped in a flannel blanket where the corners were tied at the top, and she was instructed to lie down in a fetal position. This was to mimic her being in the uterus. The pillows were placed around Candace to apply pressure to make it feel constricted like a real child in a mother's womb. The sessions begin with Julie Ponder, the licensed therapist, instructing Candace to imagine she is a little baby in her mother's womb, asking her if it's nice being warm and tight, and to feel her mother's stomach all around her.
Am I allowed to say this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my whole 40 years of life? Am I allowed to say that? Is that unethical for me to be like, this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard?
Now, like, to be fair, there are experiential interventions like a newborn rescue, but it has nothing to do, you're not jeopardizing, and this is as an adult given consent, and it's all guided imagery, really, and that's the principle of it. So I've seen amazing therapists do amazing work doing that kind of stuff, and yes, it is experiential. The clients know it's experiential. We tell them it's not evidence-based, and it can be really great for some people, and some people are like, fuck no, I don't want to do it, and they don't have to. You know what I mean? But you're not swaddling somebody and restricting air, right?
Okay, but even the people who are doing it, you have to admit that it's kind of dumb, even if it does work. Like there are certain things that I do that I'm like, this is really dumb, but I do it and it works. Am I allowed to say that that's just like the dumbest thing I've ever heard?
It's your opinion. It's your prerogative. It's okay.
I can do what I want to do.
During this process, there were 5 adults in the room: Connell Watkins, Julie Ponder, the therapist, Jeane Newmaker, the adoptive mom, Jack McDaniel, and Breda St. Clair.
Daddy Jack.
Yeah, Daddy Jack. Gross. The adults, minus St. Clair, start pressing on the pillows around Candace. 4 adults, whose combined weight was over 600 pounds, pushed against the pillows to simulate labor contractions. The child was to push herself through the sheet above her head where the corners were twisted together and thus be, quote, reborn to her adoptive mother who sat near the opening. At 1 minute and 25 seconds into this process, Ponder, Julie, the therapist, asks Candace, what do you think you thought about when you were in there? And Candace responds with, I thought I was going to die. Jeane is instructed to speak with Candace and tell her how excited she was to have Candace and the great bond they'll share. Watkins presumes to say, if the baby doesn't decide to be born, she will die. When the baby decides to be born, it's a wonderful thing.
What?
Yeah.
Babies don't born themselves. They don't birth themselves. Dumb.
For the next several minutes, it's the adults asking Candace if she's ready to be reborn, and if she stays inside, she or her mommy will die. I don't know how this is helping with trauma and attachment, but that's just me, right? At around minutes 7 and 8, Candace starts verbalizing her distress, saying things over the next several minutes like, I can't do it, I can't breathe, quit pushing on me, please, quit squishing my legs, I'm gonna die now. She's crying and screaming and pleading with them to stop. Believing that, and this is where I just kind of go into robot mode, believing that Candace was being manipulative, Connell Watkins and her associates ignored the pleas and continued with the process. The other thing I want to note is if this child had reactive attachment disorder, she probably wouldn't even be responding this way. You know what I mean? Like her reactions would be very different than this. So these adults start pushing on Candace with the pillows, again to mimic contractions in the uterus. At 14 minutes and 31 seconds, Candace says, okay, I'm dying. I'm going to die. I want to die. A couple of minutes later, she asks to have some oxygen and then says, you mean like you want me to die for real? And Julie Ponder goes, uh-huh. And Candace says, die right now and go to heaven. And Ponder says, go ahead and die right now, for real, for real. And Candace says, okay, I'm dead. This proceeds for another 5 minutes. Candace eventually vomits and defecates on herself, and the adults just keep this rebirthing session going. I'm not reading the whole script of the video because it quite literally makes me sick, so I'm just plugging in some here and there. At minutes 35 and 40, Julie Ponder and Jack McDaniel reposition themselves on Candace. Julie says she gets to be stuck in her own puke and poop. Watkins says, it's her own life. Quit her. And Candace says, no. And this was Candace's last word. The adults proceed, and Ponder repeatedly says, quitter, 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 quit, 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 quit. She's a quitter. Now, Jeannie, go ahead.
How old is this baby again?
How old is this baby? So it was in 2000. When was she born?
91?
This was born
92?
89.
89?
And so
11? I just want that to sink in for a second. This was an 11-year-old. This was probably a 5th or 6th grader.
Yeah.
That they let vomit and defecate on themselves.
Yeah, to heal her trauma.
To heal her trauma. I just want everybody to be real clear on this.
Yeah. Now, I think it's understandable. At this point, Jeannie becomes really distressed. And so Watkins escorts her out of the room to another room. Jack McDaniel takes Watkins's place and Watkins returns. Watkins tells Jack McDaniel and St. Clair to take a break. Then Watkins and Ponder start chit-chatting about their dream homes and properties being remodeled. At 1 hour and 9 minutes, they finally unwrap Candace. She has not spoken a word since minute 40, and then almost a full half hour later, they finally unwrap her. And when they unwrap her, Connell Watkins says, oh, there she is sleeping in her vomit. She repeats Candace's name to try and wake her up. Candace's face is completely blue and she's unresponsive. And so like a bad movie, Jeannie starts screaming, and because she's a pediatric nurse practitioner, she and Julie Ponder start CPR while Connell Watkins calls 911. So this is at 10:56 in the morning. 10 minutes later, the paramedics arrive. Again, according to Carla Crowder and Peggy Lowe, when the paramedics arrive, Jack tells them that Candace was left alone for 5 minutes during a rebirthing session and she isn't breathing. The paramedics find Candace on the floor. She's blue, cool to the touch, vomit on her face, and some blood around her nose, likely indicating asphyxiation. The paramedics do chest compressions and perform CPR. They work on her for just under, They work on her for just under 15 minutes. And they find a faint pulse. So Candace is airlifted. She's flighted out to the Children's Hospital. Candace is placed on life support at the hospital, but unfortunately, it was just too much for her little body. By 9 a.m., the following morning on April 19th, 2000, Candace is declared brain dead. The cause of death was from brainstem herniation and cerebral edema brought on by asphyxiation. Ooh, kid stuff, man. Can't handle it. According to state officials, Candace Newmaker's death was the first attributed to psychotherapy practice in the state of Colorado. Despite the death of Candace being considered a quote-unquote freak accident, Connell Watkins and Julie Ponder, the two therapists and their assistants, Jack McDaniel and Britta St. Clair, were swiftly charged with, quote, knowingly or recklessly committing child abuse resulting in death in 2000, not long after Candace died. Initially, upon their arrests, they were facing some hefty prison sentences of 16 to 48 years. Connell Jane Watkins, Julie Ponder, Jack McDaniel, and Britta St. Clair all pled not guilty to the charges initially. Jeane Newmaker was also charged with negligent child abuse resulting in death if convicted. She was going to face 4 to 16 years in prison.
Yeah.
The entire almost 70-minute videotape was used in court as primary evidence for the trials of Watkins, Ponder, St. Clair, McDaniel, and Newmaker. In October of 2001, Jack McDaniel and Britta St. Clair pled guilty to criminally negligent child abuse and were found guilty of reckless child abuse, in which they received a sentence of 10 years of probation, 1,000 hours of community service for their role in the suffocation death of Candace Newmaker. The arguments were that these two individuals were simply support roles in this process and were requested to participate by their leaders and boss, Connell Watkins. These individuals were not trained in any clinical capacity whatsoever and were acting solely as participants and bystanders during the rebirthing nightmare. As for Connell Watkins and Julie Ponder, their trial happened in April of 2001. On April 20th, the jurors deliberated for 5 hours before finding Connell Watkins and her assistant Julie Ponder guilty of reckless child abuse resulting in death. Watkins was also convicted of 3 other counts. Watkins was convicted of a second felony, criminal impersonation, 2 misdemeanors, obtaining a signature by deception, and unlawful practice of psychotherapy. The trial lasted for 2 months until their sentencing on June 18th in 2001, where both women were sentenced to 16 years in Colorado State Prison. During their separate sentencings in Golden, Colorado, Jefferson County Judge Jane Tidball said Candace's death was absolutely horrifying, but there is no evidence that the therapists intended to harm the child.
I don't agree with that.
Although this is the minimum sentence required for their offenses, according to an article by Larry Sarner, who was present during the trials, Judge Tidball was quoted as saying, "A 16-year sentence is a very strong statement to other mental health professionals not to do what these defendants have done." Watkins was quoted as saying, "I feel sorrow, regret, and remorse that torments me every waking hour." After the sentencing, Connell Watkins addressed the court and shared, "I failed Candace and I have failed her mother. I accept full responsibility. I am ready to accept what you require of me." According to Julie Cart in the LA Times, Candace's biological mother cried out in the courtroom after the verdict was read and later told reporters that she was not moved by the therapist's tears. She said they cried for themselves, but not for Candace. As for Candace's adoptive mother, Jeane Newmaker, she pled guilty to neglect and abuse charges and was given a 4-year deferred sentence and 400 hours of community service after she pled guilty to negligent child abuse resulting in death. After completing this, the charges were expunged from her record and her nursing license remained unsanctioned or untouched. Judge Tidball was identified as saying that Jeannie believed that the rebirthing therapy was her daughter's last chance to avoid an institution and maintain a normal life, that she came to Colorado as a parent, not as a nurse, and it would be a meaningless, punitive sanction to bar her from nursing. So what happened after the dust settled from the trial of these 5 individuals? On June 6, 2008, Connell Watkins, now known as C.J. Coyle, was paroled after 7 years in prison. According to an article from CBS for Denver, Connell was released from prison and transferred to a Denver area halfway house where she had to serve out the remaining of her sentence under intense supervision and had to wear an ankle monitor. Her release agreement puts restrictions in the type of contact she can have with children, and she can't be employed as a counselor or in any sort of psychological consulting. There were no reports on Julie Ponder that I can find other than her license was revoked and she was sentenced to 16 years. Now, in 2001, Colorado Governor Bill Owens signed a bill to outlaw the pseudoscience rebirthing practiced in the state. It became known as Candace's Law, and it says that reenactment of the birthing process through therapy techniques that involve any restraint that creates a situation in which a patient may suffer physical injury or death is outlawed, obviously. It's a felony punishment up to a year in prison and a $100,000 fine. This case was an unfortunate precedent for the clinical and counseling fields. It highlights the need for evidence-based practices, or at the very least, consent given only as adults in any fringe or experiential interventions or therapeutic practices. It created an unfortunate clinical reference that should live in the heart of every clinical professional, and it has sadly placed more responsibility on the clients and family members to do your research before engaging in any sort of clinical practices, making sure that the clinicians are licensed in their state. I feel like Candace's death was a mixture of a lot of things. It was oversights on every level: parents, clinicians, legal confines, state board requirements, everything. You know, these types of cases remind me to stay vigilant and stay careful, right? And this is why it's so important to be licensed, to have supervision, to have training, and all of this stuff, so stuff like this doesn't happen. For all my people out there listening to this case and you're horrified, saying you should never go to therapy again, please understand that this is not all therapists, right? There are definitely good therapists out there, but please make sure to do your research. Make sure that you can look it up on any state website to find if the clinician is licensed, number one, if they're in good standing with their licensing boards. Just please make sure to check on that because of the negligence of many professionals involved in this. We lost a sweet, beautiful little girl, Candace Newmaker, and that is the awful, infuriating, gut-wrenching case in the death of Candace.
You know, I have a lot of thoughts. My first question from your research, you talked a little bit about how Candace performed at school. Did it say, did she seem to be pretty well adjusted at school?
Yeah, so there were some reports that, like, what Candace's mom identified were not exact. They didn't super match what people saw at school.
Correct. So that's my first thought right there is, okay, as a parent, first of all, like, what is our end goal, right, with our kids? And for some people it's like, well, we want them to be a certain way, right? And I'm just going to boldly say, you got to get rid of that. Like, you got to get rid of thinking that your child, whoever that child is, whether it's biological, adopted, whatever else, your child might not be an all-star football player. Your child might not be the president of the debate club. Your child might not be, I don't know, emo, whatever you want your child to be, like
in my case, a good listener.
A good listener, okay? And so if your child, by all other accounts, like if you're going to school and the teachers are like, she's a joy to be around, he's doing really well, he's making good grades, he has good friends, he's kind in the lunchroom, can I just ask you to let that be enough? Because sometimes that is enough, right?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. And that's really all I'm going to say, because I like, there's an unending, this is a bottomless bowl of chips for me. Because I'm thinking, the whole time I'm thinking to myself, I'm so glad that I am now, and I have the wisdom of a 40-year-old parent who's been around the block a couple of times. Because when I first had kids, man, I was like, man, I want them to be a dancer. I want them, to love dance just like I did. You put your kid in dance, they hate every second of it. And did it break my heart? Yeah. Did it break my heart that I wasn't going to have this sweet little dancer and go to all the dance recitals? Sure, it broke my heart a little bit, but guess what? You move on. and you
No.
decide that she's going to have different dreams and she's going to look a different way.
Or you go to therapy as to why your expectations for your children dictate so much of your emotional journey.
Right? Yep. Oh,
So yeah, I mean, there's a whole lot there. And listen, it's always much more cut and dry on the outside. I have a lot of mixed emotions when it comes to adoptive mom because I really do understand the predicament that she was in.
Mhm.
You know, she was educated. She felt like she was doing everything she could for this child. I'm sure it's hard to not have a kid that you love so much warm up to you in a couple of years. You know, like what else can I do? And and I think, you know, she was trying to get professional help. She was asking for other professionals to guide her to help her daughter. And unfortunately, I think she was guided in the wrong direction. And you can't tell me that that woman does not live every day of her life regretting, you know? So I think people are going to be quick to blame the adoptive mom. And I think that's just the illusion of safety. It's to believe that A, you would never have a kid like that. B, you would be able to love them out of their reactive attachment disorder. C, you would be able to do all of the research and find the best practices.
Sure.
D, you know what I mean? Like we have this thing in our mind that makes us believe that this stuff won't happen to us. You know what I mean?
Well, and
And
again, that's where I'm like, and I'm so thankful that I can listen to this as a 40-year-old mom who's been a mom for a handful of years, because I probably would have made similar decisions because when you're a new parent, when this is your first rodeo, it's really hard. It's hard.
yeah,
And that's where I'm like, that's where I want my statement to stand of like, it's okay. Your kid doesn't have to fit whatever that mold is that you want them to fit. Sure, is
yeah,
it frustrating? Is it a little heartbreaking some days? It really is, but I'm not pointing any fingers. I'm not blaming Jeannie. I'm not doing any of that. I just am making a blanketed statement. For those of you who are listening, if you're struggling with your kid not fitting in a mold, just they are allowed to fit in a different mold.
yeah. And I think probably the harder version of this is if you feel like your kids aren't showing you the love that you crave or desire or need, then that's an opportunity for you to figure out why do you depend on that so much,
Or get a Cocker Spaniel. They'll show you all the love you want and need. But again,
right?
that's why I asked you, was she well adjusted at school? Like I was trying to see, like, was this girl in every scenario, in every setting, showing this quote unquote sign of rad?
Yeah, but I also think that some of those reports are a little skewed because I think a lot of the reports were filtered through Jeannie, right? So unless people did the footwork and tracked down her teachers, the preachers, and everybody you know in her life for those 2 years to speak to that, I don't know.
And again, this is more of a general statement. If your kid is well adjusted at school, if your kid is well adjusted, it could just be you. You know what I mean? Like it might not be anything wrong with
Or
your
it's the
kid.
complete opposite. And maybe she was having such a hard time at home because she felt safe around Jeannie, right?
Sure.
She might have acted out more so because she felt safe and stable and secure with her bio mom. You know, that might have been the safest place for her to lash out. I don't
With her
know.
adopted mom, you mean?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, for adopted mom. So,
Yeah.
you know,
I
there's
know.
100 things, but all I know is that little girl, nobody showed up for her.
And that's another thing, when the two people, when Daddy Jack and whoever that person was, they were like, well, we were just asked to be in this room. This whole bystander effect really burns my biscuits. You know what? It's like, well, I don't know. I'm not, and I'm like, but you know what? You're a human being, and step in and be like, you know what, guys? I think she needs a break.
No, I see. I disagree with you on that. I think that's still that illusion of safety. I think that it's much easier to think that you can just step in and be like, "Oh, this is going to." They're not the professionals in the room. They're they're you know, I don't know. They scooped them out of the middle of Colorado to come work with them.
Yeah. Well,
They don't know the limitations of the therapy. You know, like they don't know all of that stuff. And that's why, you know, and I have a different perspective because there is a there is a lot of weight on my shoulders as a clinician because who is going to be the person who gets sued? It's not going to be the techs that I work with, you know. It's not going to be, you know, the secretary and it's going to be the licensed professionals in the room.
yeah.
And so that's why we have an extra strong responsibility and ethical commitment to make sure that we do everything that's the best for the client. So I, and I understand that whole, you should want to jump in and say stop, but you're also working for this quote unquote nationally renowned thing, and you're being told that this kid's manipulative and she's going to try everything to get out of it. I understand that it's a lot more complicated in those moments than we like to look back and speculate over.
I just hope that if I'm in a room and a kid is throwing up and pooping all over himself, that I would step in and stop it. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah. I
So,
mean,
if a kid is throwing up and pooping all over themselves, please step in and stop it. I guess that's what I'm going to end on, because seriously, I'm so pissed. I don't think I've ever been this pissed off. And so we should probably just be like, thanks for hanging out with us, because I just can't with this episode.
yeah, I think everybody's going to be pissed from this. And I think this will be a great opportunity. So whenever we have the interview with me, we can have some real hardcore discussions about therapy, about ethics, about all of that stuff, right?
Yep. All right, guys. Well, come back for the interview with Bailey. You won't want to miss it. I can guarantee that.
I also think that we should do boundary Mondays and just have everybody, listeners, write in questions, and Chelsea and I answer how you set boundaries around it.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what I want to do. So anyways, that's it. That's the worst ever. And I hate every second of it. And I am so sad for that sweet little girl.
Yeah.
And I want to forget about this for now and go fly headfirst into ignorance, so I don't have to think about the travesties of it.
I hope that nobody forgets about this. I hope that this dictates most of the decisions of your day-to-day life. I hope that you think to yourself, is this ethical? Is this the right thing that I'm going to be doing? I hope that this is so impactful that you're like, ooh, I mean, I know that I'm showing them quote unquote hard love, but is that really what I'm doing? So, all right, guys. Well,
thanks for hanging out with us.
And we'll catch you on the wild side.
Bye, guys.
Later, Gators. Hey, Wildside Tribe. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Wildside Podcast.
Make sure to tune in on Wildside Wednesdays. New episodes will drop each Wednesday at 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
We would love to hear from you, so if you have a wild case recommendation, email us at wildsidepodcast@gmail.com. That's wildside with a C. Or share your thoughts in the comments below.
As always, if you haven't heard it today, you're loved, you're worthy, and you're valuable. And we'll catch you on
The flip side.